Most people picture ninja as black-clad assassins slipping through moonlight with magic in their hands. That image is almost entirely false, and the truth is far more dangerous. Real ninja were not fantasy warriors born from smoke and legend. They were covert specialists shaped by civil war, hunger, betrayal, and the brutal mathematics of survival. And the first twist is this: they did not rise in spite of samurai power. They rose because warlords desperately needed what samurai honor could not provide. In the 15th and 16th centuries, Japan was tearing itself apart. The old order was splintering. Rival lords fought without pause. Alliances shifted, castles changed hands, and a victory won at sunrise could become a funeral by nightfall. In that kind of world, triumph no longer belonged to the bravest man with a sword. It belonged to the side that discovered a weakness first, poisoned trust inside an enemy camp, burned supplies before dawn, and disappeared before anyone understood what had happened. That is where the real ninja entered history, not as icons, not as supernatural figures, as practical answers to a nation drowning in suspicion and blood. Their roots took hold in rough country, especially in Iga and Kōka, isolated mountain regions where independent communities learned to outthink stronger enemies because they had no other choice. These were not glamorous places. They were hard landscapes of narrow paths, steep forests, poor farmland, and villages full of farmers, minor warriors, monks, and families who survived only by adapting faster than the people trying to dominate them. The mountains taught them everything: how to move without sound, how to read weather, stone, and shadow, how to vanish into terrain that seemed empty to outsiders but alive to locals. In those regions, the land itself became an ally. Ravines turned into traps. Fog became cover. Silence became a weapon. Over time, survival methods became habits. Habits became systems. Systems became traditions. And traditions hardened into the disciplined craft later called ninjutsu. But another myth needs to die here. Most ninja were not constant assassins. Their most valuable weapon was information. Information wins wars before armies ever collide. They gathered fortress layouts, troop strength, food reserves, weak gates, hidden paths, escape routes, schedules, alliances, and rumors sharp enough to cut through trust like a blade. A skilled operative could make an enemy feel defeated days before a battle even began. The pressure of not knowing who had betrayed you, which guard had been bribed, or whether your own walls had already been measured from the outside could become unbearable. Sometimes fear killed confidence long before steel touched flesh. The communities of Iga and Kōka organized themselves in loose family networks and local leagues, resilient enough that destroying one group did not erase the entire tradition. That structure mattered because powerful warlords hated anything they could not fully control. Independent mountain fighters who understood sabotage, infiltration, and local terrain were not curiosities. They were threats. Eventually, one of the most formidable men in Japanese history came for them. Oda Nobunaga did not look at Iga and see a remote curiosity. He saw defiance. He saw a dangerous pocket of resistance in a time when he was trying to crush rivals and force the country into submission. He saw something that refused to kneel. When his forces first moved into the region, the defenders answered with ambushes, sudden night strikes, hidden routes, and terrain so punishing it seemed almost sentient. Soldiers vanished into ravines. Scouts disappeared. Signals failed. Columns broke formation in the dark. Panic spread faster than orders. Nobunaga's men discovered a terrifying fact. When the enemy knows the land better than you know your own fear, the ground itself begins to feel hostile. Nobunaga returned with overwhelming force. Numbers, organization, and ruthless intent can crush even the cleverest resistance if applied hard enough. In 1581, Iga was devastated. Villages burned, families scattered, strongholds fell. A tradition forged in secrecy was forced into flight, simply to survive. It sounds like the end of the story, It was not. The knowledge escaped with the people, and once scattered, it became even more valuable. Exiles carried techniques, local networks, habits of concealment, and generational experience into the service of other powers. Some found a place under Tokugawa Ieyasu, a leader pragmatic enough to understand that invisible skill could shape visible history. And this is where the story deepens, because real ninja were not just survivors of war. They were often trained from childhood to become instruments of patience. Training could begin early, sometimes around 5 or 6 years old, with lessons that looked simple until you realized each detail was preparing a child for danger. They learned controlled breathing, silent walking, balance on unstable surfaces, awareness of weight distribution, and the discipline to remain motionless for astonishing lengths of time. Endurance mattered as much as technique. They ran long mountain routes. They climbed difficult surfaces. They swam in cold water. They built strength through repetition rather than display. One famous tradition claimed children jumped over a hemp plant every day as it grew, turning the plant's rising height into a lesson in relentless progress. Whether every version of that story was literal matters less than what it reveals. Training was not treated as a burst of intensity. It was treated as a daily reshaping of the body and mind. But physical preparation was only the outer shell. The deeper craft was psychological, and that is where the real danger began. A ninja had to understand people as well as terrain. They studied accents, posture, habits, routines, status markers, and the tiny tells that reveal fear, arrogance, greed, exhaustion, or weakness. Disguise was not a costume. It was performance so complete that a suspicious guard might trust you with his own gate key. A convincing monk needed prayers, vocabulary, and doctrine. A merchant needed prices, routes, and believable complaints about roads and taxes. A servant needed invisibility so perfect that no one bothered to remember the face. That was the real art, not standing out. Looking ordinary, useful, forgettable, and that made them extraordinarily dangerous. Because the most effective operative was often the one nobody would ever imagine as a threat. A laborer, a courier, a pilgrim, a cook, a groom, a porter, someone who moved between spaces others considered beneath notice. Women, too, played roles that history often pushed into shadow. In households, private chambers, and social settings where armed men would attract instant suspicion, access could be gained through intimacy, service, or familiarity. In a world built on rigid expectations, those expectations themselves could become openings. The ninja arsenal followed the same logic as their disguises. Tools were practical first. Frightening only when necessity forced them into violence. Shuriken were real, but not in the way modern fantasy imagines. They were often used to distract, wound, disrupt, or create a moment of confusion. They were not magical Death Stars slicing perfectly through the night. The straight-bladed ninja sword, so famous in later fiction, was prized less for romance than for usefulness. Compact, adaptable, and easier to handle in confined spaces, it fit practical needs better than ceremonial ideals. Even the scabbard could serve more than one purpose. It might help measure distance, support climbing, or function in improvised ways under pressure. Kunai were just as unglamorous. They were digging, prying, scraping, and climbing tools first, with violence as a secondary use. The kusarigama, a sickle with a weighted chain, reflected the ninja mindset perfectly. Take something familiar and turn it into a terrifying surprise. Then there were powders, smoke devices, hidden writing kits, coded messages, portable ladders, climbing claws, and tools for listening through thin walls or working locks in darkness. None of this was mystical. It was chemistry, patience, improvisation, and ruthless efficiency, dressed in the plainest forms possible. But here comes the deeper twist. The ninja's most sophisticated weapon was not steel, poison, or fire. It was the human mind. A rumor planted in the right ear could split allies apart. A forged letter could move armies. A staged accident could make a commander suspect betrayal from within his own circle. Fear, once seeded correctly, multiplies by itself. Ninja understood anger, greed, vanity, sympathy, panic, and pride. Pull the right thread, and an entire fortress could begin to unravel without a single gate being battered down. Some operatives even encouraged stories that made them seem supernatural, because frightened enemies make mistakes faster than rational ones. If a sentry believed the enemy could vanish into darkness, then every shifting shadow became a threat. If he thought demons walked the walls, smoke alone could trigger panic. The trick was not to become supernatural. The trick was to persuade the enemy that reason no longer protected him. That blend of reality and fear made ninja devastatingly effective in real campaigns. At sieges, they identified weak entries, vulnerable storehouses, guard rotations, and internal disputes. Sometimes they infiltrated to open gates. Sometimes they spread chaos from within. Sometimes they merely reported enough truth to let a commander strike at exactly the right moment. At other times, they served as scouts ahead of armies, crossing dangerous ground to locate water, road conditions, hidden ambushes, weak bridges, and shifting enemy positions. Their reports gave commanders something priceless in war: clarity. And clarity, in the middle of chaos, can look a lot like destiny. One of the most famous episodes tied to ninja tradition came after the death of Nobunaga, when Tokugawa Ieyasu found himself stranded in hostile territory and at serious risk of being killed. According to long-standing accounts, networks from Iga and Kōka helped guide him through hidden routes, arrange safe passage, and move him through danger alive. That escape mattered. The man who survived it would eventually rule Japan. Sometimes history turns not on grand speeches or heroic charges, but on quiet roads, concealed paths, and the people no one notices until it is too late. By the time of Sekigahara and the struggles around the rise of Tokugawa power, intelligence networks likely played an important role in monitoring troop movement, uncertain loyalties, and political weakness. Historians still debate the exact scale of ninja influence in some of these events. But the larger pattern is unmistakable. Leaders who know more usually survive longer than leaders who know less. Then peace arrived, and peace changed everything. Once Tokugawa rule stabilized Japan, there were fewer rival lords to infiltrate, fewer castles to sabotage, and fewer shifting fronts where covert warfare could tip the balance. The long age of internal chaos that had made ninja indispensable began to close. The very skills that once made them useful now made them suspicious. Some entered official service as guards, watchers, intelligence personnel, or specialists attached to regional authorities. But the old world that created them was disappearing beneath them. Others faced distrust, heavy burdens, or a future in which their family skills no longer had an honorable or profitable place. Some hid their heritage. Some adapted as instructors, bodyguards, or local enforcers. Some resisted the new order and were crushed for it. By the 18th century, organized ninja traditions had largely dissolved into fragments, lineages, scattered records, and half-hidden memory. That should have been the true ending. Instead, something stranger happened. The less real ninja remained, the more powerful the legend became. During the peaceful Edo period, theater and fiction began transforming practical spies into supernatural beings who could vanish, fly, walk on water, and command impossible forces. The iconic black costume did not come from battlefield reality. It came largely from stage convention. In theater, stagehands wore black so the audience would treat them as unseen. Over time, that visual shorthand fused with the idea of stealth. A trick of performance eventually rewrote global memory. Stories piled on hand signs, invisibility, elemental powers, and bloodline mysticism. The shadow operative stopped being a human specialist and became myth itself. Yet buried in manuals and surviving texts, a more sober voice remained. Works like the Banzen Shukai, the Shoninki, and the Ninpadan preserved a version of the craft that feels very different from modern fantasy. These writings do not read like magical scripture. They read like handbooks of observation, infiltration, timing, discipline, deception, and adaptation under pressure. They spend far more time on disguise, rumor, information gathering, and human behavior than on sword fights or glorious killing. That alone tells us something essential. A true ninja aimed to succeed without being noticed. Open combat was often evidence that the mission had already gone wrong. Then the modern world arrived, and the ninja came back once again, not as covert operatives, as cultural icons too marketable to remain buried. Iga and Kōka rebuilt public memory through museums, reconstructed houses, demonstrations, performances, festivals, and tourist experiences that turned secrecy into spectacle. There is an irony in that. The descendants of invisible specialists now preserve their legacy by being seen, photographed, and performed before crowds. At the same time, martial arts schools and later organizations claim to preserve authentic lineages, though scholars continue debating where uninterrupted tradition ends and modern reconstruction begins. Then global entertainment poured fuel on the fire. Films, comics, animation, television, and video games transformed ninja into superhuman action figures with impossible acrobatics, endless throwing stars, magical disappearances, and costumes designed more for branding than stealth. The fantasy became so successful that it looped back into Japan itself, influencing modern depictions there as well. At a certain point, ninja no longer meant spy, scout, infiltrator, or saboteur. It meant mystery itself. So what is left when the smoke clears? A truth more human than the legend. And maybe that is exactly why it feels more unsettling. The real ninja were neither demons nor superheroes. They were disciplined specialists in survival, disguise, sabotage, intelligence, and calculated fear. They were shaped by war, often drawn from ordinary backgrounds, and made extraordinary by training, observation, and the willingness to work without applause. They did not conquer history with magic. They influenced it with timing, patience, deception, and the ability to stay alive where others failed. And maybe that is the final irony. We buried their true brilliance under fantasy because ordinary humans are not supposed to be that effective. We are comfortable with legends because legends feel safely unreal. But the truth is harder to shake. The truth says a patient mind can rival an army. It says information can beat courage. It says silence, preparation, and understanding human weakness can outlast empires. The legend is louder, but the truth cuts deeper, because the real ninja did achieve immortality, just not in the way movies promised. They survived by becoming a shadow larger than themselves, a myth stretched across centuries. But beneath that myth, the older shape still remains. Not a sorcerer, not a masked acrobat, not a creature of smoke, but a human being trained to weaponize attention, absence, and fear. That is what made them dangerous then. And honestly, it is what still makes them unforgettable now. If this story changed the way you see ninja, subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and comment what city or country you're watching from.